Hey, Ernie,
Hello, Steve.
you're you're challenging my technical abilities.
If
And
that's all I challenge, Steve, you would be a much more peaceful person.
how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. We are getting ready to go on vacation, and we're mostly packed and winding things down. So,
Oh, that's right. Okay. And you're still willing to log in on Tuesday.
I will give it a shot. Yes.
That should be good. Does your family is your family okay with you hanging out with us for that hour?
Yeah, they figure if it's just 1 hour on a phone call, and then they can live with it.
That's great. Great support.
Yeah. So, how are you doing?
It's been I'm doing okay. I've had some challenges, I've had some breakthroughs, I've had some new insights about who I am as a professional, lots of conversations around that topic. Um, Much of it is the catalyst for it has been I initiated a website redesign for my business.
Mm,
Well, that
which is
requires you.
called, I don't know if I've seen your business website before.
Uh, yeah, it's just about me. It's called Divergent Ed Consultants, but
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard the name.
nothing extraordinary. The web designer has some very clever ideas, so I'm waiting to see what he visually will do with a few ideas that I have discussed with him. But the more important part is I've had to rethink, what am I going to say about myself?
Mm,
Um, and is it going to change from what I've said before, or do I add to it? How much of a redesign am I going to do? Content as well as the visual look and feel. So I realized about 3 days ago, as I tried to define myself, I said, if I tell people that I do instructional design, then I get instructional design projects. I get I'll and I said, is that really what I want to do? I said, well, I like doing that, but what I like better is I like teaching and coaching people how to do it. And so
hmm
take that word coaching. So what is it that I do if I consider myself a coach? And that opened up a long conversation with my counselor. Gave me some great insight. He's known me for 5 years. And he said, well, you're more than a coach. So let's explore what the more possibilities are. And we walked through some analogies that are very common. One of them is if you watch the game of basketball, there's a position called a point guard, and the point guard
hmm
is the floor general. The point guard is the one who orchestrates the events that are going on dynamically on the court in order to get something done, to lead the team in a certain direction with the goal of being successful.
From
And
the field.
yes, but sometimes he gets a break and he's standing on the sideline. And from that position, he's talking to his teammates, and he's coaching, and he's mentoring, and he's getting feedback, and he's seeking advice, and they're creating strategies. So just because he's not on the court doesn't mean he stopped his job. And as the counselor unfolded that analogy, right, I said, I know enough about basketball. I know enough about what the point guard does. It really started to make sense. We couldn't quite come up with a word. I said, I can't put on my website that I'm the point guard. I have to find another way to describe it. So all of that is to say, it really triggered a deeper reflection on what I would prefer to do, which is coaching around the subjects of instructional design, visual literacy, visual communications. And all of that is within the context of education. So it's an interesting shift, because yes, I can still do the instructional design work, but I probably should stop calling myself an instructional designer and think of a different term that describes the coaching that I do with respect to working with educators and helping them see greater possibilities for teaching and learning when they do instructional design.
It's interesting. The other phrase I've heard, like the way you describe a point guard, is the player coach.
Yeah. Isaiah Thomas played that role for a while.
And is that part of the vibe you're going towards? Is that the idea of both being able to do it yourself or?
I guess that is accurate. Yeah, because of yes. So when I have facilitated teams of teachers to develop curriculum, to the extent that I could be in there at the table, in the space, at the table with them, co-designing the curriculum, I did. I had to defer more often because they were the grade level experts. I was not. So I would listen and then offer suggestions and guidance for how they could create a curriculum around their ideas. So yes, sometimes I could step in as the player with them. It really depends on the content and the subject. With the higher education faculty that I work with, I'm much more of a player, even if it's not my field, because they're working with adult learners. And some of the primary things that are taught in higher education is communication skills, learning skills, giving students an assignment that actually teaches them the professional skills of learning within a field. So yeah, I have a lot of ideas about that. So I do become more of a player coach in that context, for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's also interesting that there isn't a good word for this in English. The line between, in sports, you have your players, and then usually after you've been a player and you're retired and no longer able to play, you become a coach.
Yeah.
Right? And in education, as you probably know better than I do, education has been increasingly professionalized, where the vast majority of educators are not really expected to practice what they are doing. Or if you're in a university which is focused on research, like I was, being a teacher is an afterthought that you pay, a tax you pay to recruit more researchers.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And this idea of someone who is so passionate about a field that they both do it themselves and mentor and coach others to do it better, that seems like an incredibly valuable and important kind of person to have, and we have no word for it.
No, we don't. So my counselor said, make one up, Steve. He said, do you know any linguists? I said, well, I do happen to know a linguist. He says, well, you know what prefixes are, you know what a core word could be, and you know what a suffix is. So with those three elements, a pre-word, there's probably another word for that. The pre, the core, and the suffix, and see what you can come up with. The closest existing term is maestro. So think about the conductor of an orchestra. At the same time that he leads, the orchestra plays, but it really wouldn't play very well if he weren't intimately connected to them and involved in the process. It's not as if he stands on the sideline. He's actively involved in guiding them in what they need to do. So that's the closest term that I've been able to come up with that has an English definition.
It's interesting. I saw this in action. The Count Basie Orchestra came to my son's school. And there's a guy who's the sort of conductor, but he will also frequently pick up his trumpet and play along with them. Yes,
excellent.
And yet, yeah, there's still not a good word for it.
Yeah, so how many, when you saw them perform, was it 20 people, 30?
It was 20 or less. It was like 12 to 20, small. I forget exactly.
Yeah.
Small, yeah. It's an ensemble. He called it an orchestra, but it's,
Did he? Yeah. I would have called it a jazz ensemble, and then I've seen that happen many times where the jazz musician who's leading the ensemble is also a player, actively involved in playing, performing, making the music, and he'll take a few breaks to look at the other players and then guide them where he wants to go if they're not picking up on it from the way that he's playing. Sometimes they can lead by the way they play. At least,
so the
at least
I was Googling this because like it seems like jazz is a big deal. And so the word that they sometimes use is band leader.
Band leader, yeah.
And because some of them really violently object to the word conductor, even though a lot of people use it.
So I have to put that one down and keep it in front of my eyes so I see it more frequently and can think and noodle on it. In the meantime, I just have to use a lot more words to put it on my, before the web designer starts putting content into pages, I want to be sure that I'm giving him the right, accurate idea of what we're trying to convey.
Yeah, well, so I'm not a linguist, I'm not, but I do make up words quite a bit, and this is the thing I've been, like one of the words that I've been using lately is domaganto. I may have thrown it out there before you showed up on our the Biastes, another word.
Yes, yeah.
That I sort of co-opted. And domaganto is an Esperanto term meaning question tamer.
Oh.
Because the idea that I had was that, one of the problems with and it's interesting, I've been looking at the word teacher, as you remember from our chat thread. And there's two different senses of the word teacher. One, which is the English word teach, and the Hebrew word is point. It comes from index finger.
Oh, right. You brought this up.
The one who points things out, right? Whereas the other word is closer to educator, which is sort of imparter of knowledge. And, education, as we discussed, actually means to lead like an animal. Right?
There's some irony in that.
There's an entire critique of civilization in that, which we may get to. But the idea of, for me, the idea of domaganto is one of the problems we have is that we expect people to be an expert. Like, I've had pastors apologize for not knowing the answer to a question. Well, you would think that I know the answers to all these questions after being to seminary. It's like, well, no, I don't. But I realize most people actually do. And to have a hard question and not have an answer is shameful in many professions. That's
interesting. I said to Gloria yesterday, Ernie, having a PhD is, so I said, what does it mean to me to have a PhD? It means that I know I don't know all the answers and how complex it is to even grasp a domain of knowledge. So it is pointing out to me a lot more of what I don't know than I see with people who don't have one. They presume that there is a way to know what is supposed to be known. Like what you were just saying, like, aren't I just supposed to know this? No, that's not actually true. Not necessarily.
Yeah, what's funny is that, in science, we've mostly, within science, we mostly have the sense of PhD as, someone who's mastered the basics and can start going into deep things. The problem, of course, is that doctorate comes after master. And master implies mastery.
Yeah.
Interesting. One place where and so there is that thing. One place where the concept of expertise seems to still have that connotation is martial arts.
Yes.
Right. Like when you see a black belt, you understand that that person has mastered the basics, but then there's many degrees beyond that.
Yeah.
And they're qualified to teach. But then this idea of this is one of the things I think that's interesting from a Eastern perspective versus a Western perspective
Yes.
is this idea of a deliberate practice, and that it being a practitioner or a student of something is seen as a quest rather than an achievement. Possibly because the East had other much stricter versions of dominance and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So a fun word to play with in that context is sensei.
I saw that you shared that post from Ted.
And I just put it in the chat for Wikipedia. So it literally means the one who comes before.
That's what
Which
sensei
is
means?
interesting. Yeah. It's like they've been much like the word pointer. Someone who's done this before, pointing out how to do it. There's a you must be familiar with Dreyfus levels of expertise, right?
Which levels of expertise?
Dreyfus levels?
I haven't heard of Dreyfus.
Really? Okay, you never know which things people are like familiar with and which things are foreign languages to them.
Does he come out of?
He came out of skill acquisition is the discipline. But yeah, it's really weird things that I ran across this. He came out of nursing. And he discovered that there are some nurses who are 10 times more effective than others, but it wasn't just based on seniority.
Right.
And so we actually broke down and different levels. Let me share the screen. As long as we're doing the Zoom thing, we may as well make it useful.
Nursing education, interestingly enough, is its own discipline in itself, nursing and medical practice, but nursing education. Instructional designers are often called in and they use similar processes, and yet there's still another difference to it because of how much hands-on work nurses need to do. So, hey, look at that.
Yeah, but yeah, so the idea is that, and this is, I've heard this used in programming contexts as well. And one of the, there's different levels, and if you find someone who's an expert on it, then you know that they know the rules, they understand the rules, they can explain the rules to others, and then they can know when to break the rules.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So those levels of perspective there, and so that's another concept of proficiency and expertise. One of the interesting implications of the model is that it's easiest to teach someone, to be taught by someone who is one level ahead of you.
Yeah.
Because if there are too many levels ahead of you, like Feynman's famous lectures on physics were mostly of interest to other professors who could actually understand it.
Yeah.
Because the pedagogical skill of breaking it down is much harder.
Yeah. Yeah. I could see that challenge.
Yeah. And one of the other things that is interesting is this distinction between learning and competence.
Yep.
Like I've heard someone say, children learn naturally, but they do not like to learn. They like to do.
Okay. I've heard that also said in a different way.
Okay, Chris, how have you heard it said?
It's the Chinese proverb about tell me what to do and I'll probably remember 10% of it. Show me what to do, I'll remember 20 or 30% of it. Let me do it and I'll remember 90% of it. It's that type of hierarchy.
Yeah. So, as we're going through all this, I'm rethinking a lot of my framings of, this is an interesting one. The stages of competence.
Yes, I'm very familiar with this one. This is one that my counselor and I have had extensive conversations about.
Funny, I first heard this at Apple when someone was explaining Apple University to me, and actually it was management training. And they said that when someone they use negative feedback when people have unconscious incompetence and conscious competence. and use positive feedback when people have conscious incompetence and unconscious competence. It's like, wow, I don't know if it's entirely true, but it's still a really powerful rubric.
Yes.
Do you tell people what they're doing right or what they're doing wrong? And this gives you a way to frame that. Anyway, so many different scaffoldings there. But it raises an interesting question. I remember hearing this. I was listening to a guy talking about self-learning. This was a YouTube video from my friend Bill. And he was talking about self-learning, and he says there are three parts to it. Basically, there's the absorbing information from others, there's reflecting on it critically, and then there's being able to articulate it, you know, and implement it and actually live it out. And those three cycles. He said, well, part of the problem of, he called it synoptic reading or synoptic learning, where you read multiple, or syntopical, that was the word.
Oh, okay. No, yeah, don't know that word, but it's a great one.
I didn't either. So, so syntopical means you read multiple things and you compare and contrast them to try to achieve objective truth. And what was funny about that is someone in the audience actually asked on the Zoom call, how much do you have to do to get to objective truth? And he kind of had to waffle a bit and say, well, you know, if you read several things, you know, then you have it. It's like, I have realized that this Western obsession with objective truth is incredibly powerful and horribly deceptive.
Yeah, like, yes, because it leads you to believe you can actually find it.
Right, yeah, and the more interesting phrase that, interestingly, when I was working with a virtual reality startup, the word I was trying to get them to use there was, because they would have cameras that they would place around a room, and then they would reconstruct those multiple images together into a 3D reconstruction, which I refer to as the global reconciliation of multiple perspectives, which is an interesting phrase in a lot of ways. Because the idea, and so I introduced the concept of the transsubjective. So when you and I compare perspectives, it would be arrogant to say we have achieved objective truth, but we have found a truth that spans our individual subjective perspectives.
Yes, yeah, trans, great. It makes sense.
Transsubject, right? And the idea of, very similar to Wikipedia's idea of a neutral point of view, is like, we're not saying this is truth, we're saying at least it aggregates all the truth of everyone who's participated so far.
Right, yes.
And that makes it very clear that this is probably one of the most profound realizations I've had in the last 5 years, which is, you know, very antithetical to my training as a physicist. It is that reality is contextual. And we'd like to think that reality just is.
No, well, no, it has to be described in some context, just like you said.
Yeah, and you know, in physics, it's actually blatantly obvious. Whether you're talking at the level, if you're moving at the speed of light, everything is instantaneous for one thing. And, you know, if you're at high enough energies, everything is just, you know, subatomic particles. But if you're moving much slower, you know, then you see atoms, and slower still, you see molecules and subjects. And like, there's this weird bias in Western philosophy that assumes Aristotelian logic and Newtonian mechanics and atomic theory are what's real. And everything above and below that is a footnote. And I think part of that is because Newtonian mechanics was kind of the triumph of, and you know, Descartes and all that was kind of the triumph of objective thinking, the subject-object distinction, mind-body distinction, et cetera, right? That there's objective facts that you can measure, which is almost true.
Yeah, yeah, almost. It's
except
like
when it's not.
But again, the context in which it is being spoken and being applied to is going to play a major factor. I can see from the science perspective that there are truths that have been, I don't know if truths is the right word, there have been properties of our world that, you know, they can show over and over again. So gravity exists. And
well, gravity exists, but even when we say gravity exists, right? Because we are on a sphere, bounded, right? If we were free floating in space, gravity would not exist to us.
yes. So then we have to have the right context. Which gravity are we talking about? And right now, the one that we know most of all is the Earth one that we are on. But the moon has a different
right. But
gravity.
when we say gravity, we really mean the way we experience gravity, ironically, is actually the Earth or the structures underneath us pushing up against us in response to gravity.
How interesting.
Right? Is if you're falling in an elevator,
Yeah.
you're experiencing gravity, but you don't feel it all. We think of,
Yeah.
so the reality of it is there, but what we
Yes.
perceive and measure is literally the opposite of gravity.
The opposite, the Earth pushing back on us.
Right, and Einstein understood this at a deep level, which is why he was able to reinterpret gravity. So like, even things that are simple and obvious facts doesn't
Wow.
actually mean that we're experiencing them correctly.
In education, we call it constructing, co-constructing knowledge, when a group of people are sharing ideas together and discussing how they know it, to what degree do they know something, what are the interconnected parts. So then we get into concept mapping or mind mapping around a domain of knowledge. And co-constructing or being a co-constructor is a critical element, particularly for faculty members. But we also try to do this with children in elementary school, when we ask them to work with a partner, to read the same article and then to each summarize their understanding of the article and then compare their two summaries together in a Venn diagram-like manner. That is co-constructing knowledge. And it's deepened when you then say to the two students or the group of students, tell me what you know. Don't just read what you wrote, tell me what you know. So getting them to speak about it and to think through, oh, I know this because my partner John shared this with me, or he showed this to me, or because I was the one who read that in the article. And then we get to have a greater understanding of, well, how do we know this? We know it because it was John's personal experience, or because we read it in the article. Yes, exactly.
So,
Also,
the one thing, articulate, I guess, is sometimes a word that has both the connotations of performance and explanation.
Yes, think,
But
pair, share.
I want to go back to co-constructor.
Co-constructor.
Like, that's not a good marketing term, but that's not a bad way for you to introduce your role when you're leading one of these workshops or activities.
Yes. In effect, it is what I say to them when I am there with them. I always present myself as a partner in the process of figuring out what we're about to do. That my role is to facilitate their thinking. It's to help their understanding shine and be explained and heard. In some cases, and well, actually in the two cases where I was specifically designated as facilitator, I also had to be the equity coach as well. I had to make sure that each person's voice was heard and that no one's voice was being, or opinions were being pushed aside, but each was being carefully evaluated. So it was very interesting. And they were community-based roles. I'm working with community partners, parents, students, faculty members, administrators, both at the school level and at the district level.
Cool. So this is that's a good jumping off point for a hard left turn to the thing I really wanted to talk to you about.
Yeah, what's up,
which
man?
is Father's Day.
Oh yeah, there we go. Tomorrow. Happy
and your article,
Father's Day to you in advance.
Happy Father's Day to you. But the article that you drafted and that you'll be posting, I guess. But this idea of every voice being heard, and tragically, you're actually the only African American male that I've had serious conversations with There's some African American females I've interacted with, which is a
Mhm.
whole different layer of complexity that's harder for me to deal with.
Yes.
And yeah, the fact that we built a relationship by even knowing you're African American creates some really useful cognitive dissonance.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right, and you mentioned before when we were having a chat about like what could you possibly do to help our church, is that you kind of oscillated between genteel brother and angry black man.
Yeah, it only took 5 minutes. It cracked me up when I realized what was happening.
So one of the things that we talked about last week is it feels like that's a journey that you are particularly on during this season.
Yes,
Is that
yes.
you've definitely been on the genteel, you've definitely played the genteel brother card much more often.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Have you had many opportunities to experience yourself as an angry black man?
Prior to the last few weeks?
Yeah.
Yes, but in each, it was a specific context. So if I go backwards in time, it was the summer of 2017, I believe. I was invited to speak at Stanford. Not that Stanford invited me, the conference was being held at Stanford. It was for black educators primarily, but all educators were invited to attend, but the speakers were black. And the organizer, whom I spent hours talking with, introduced me in such a way that she realized she didn't even know if I was black. and I'm looking across the, I'm in the front, and I'm ready to start my talk, and she's giving me the introduction, and everyone in the room knows her. So she's like mom. So everyone is paying attention to her.
Is she
and she's
African
just talking.
American or not?
She is. Oh no, she is. No doubt. And I look back and so now the spotlight's on me, and I'm going, oh, how interesting.
Did she even say that she didn't know?
She did say that she didn't know. She said she accepted me as such because a mutual black friend had recommended that she connect with me. And all the time, I mean, I had met with her many times, many times, and I was connecting with her on every black issue, every black topic. So I was really surprised. But I did understand why she said what she said. In a way, she's trying to tell the audience that don't be deceived by the way he looks, but listen to him. And she thinks different. She thinks differently than most people do. So I said, I don't think she means anything negative by this at all. This is just who she is and how she talks. And she often will say something that you realize if she had had a moment to edit what she said, she probably would have. But she was talking too fast. So I
resemble that remark.
Yeah, too funny. So Ernie, I was there for 3 days, and in those 3 days, I was rewoke to the issues of African Americans and how history has been written about African Americans. And rewoke means, well, there must have been a previous time when I was woke. Well, that would go all the way back to 1982, 83, when I lived in the African American theme house at Stanford University, and I was accepted by the black community. 50% of the house residents were African American or identified as black. So the theme, the activities, and the guest speakers, the activities that we did were all centered around black culture. It's pretty awesome. Well, they accepted me. And then I became very much aware of what it meant to be a 20-year-old black high school student, college student. Through their life experiences in Chicago or St. Louis or Florida or Southern California, I learned a lot. I learned how to be black, in essence. That was the first awakening. And then, as I mentioned, many years later until, so that was 1982, 83, and I lived there for 3 years. and I was a part of the community, and I've maintained many relationships with African-American friends that I met. So then you fast forward all those years until 2017, when I was invited to be a part of an education group of Black educators, and to be accepted into the group as a speaker, but still always feeling like I was a little bit to the outside because I was a new person, and I had to handle some pushback from a well-known African-American author who wrote the book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? His name is Beverly Tatum. So interestingly enough, at the moment that she gave me some pushback after my talk, where she cautioned everyone to be wary of my perspective, to be wary of how I had formulated my perspective and what my background was to even present the perspective that I shared. And I thought, okay, well, she's not wrong. I mean, we should always listen to someone in the context of what are they speaking from? I think I had done
she was going from beyond, but she was not accepting you as a member of the tribe with sort of the default level of trust.
At that moment in time, I would say that was true.
Yeah.
She softened her position a little bit later when I had a private conversation with her. But I didn't actually have to stand and defend myself. Others in the room did.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, so that was very, very interesting. I wasn't offended in any way. I came and I did what I was supposed to do, and I did it to the best of my ability. And the rest of the audience, now, I should point out, what I did is I created, rather than talk to them for 90 minutes, I invited them into thinking activities like the ones we just talked about, where you're thinking, sharing.
Co-construction, yeah.
And I had them talking to each other. Not one of the other 6 presenters over those 3 days did that. I did it because that's what I do. And I watched the energy level in that conference room elevate to such a high degree that when we got to the end, someone stood up and said, "What just happened here?" And I knew what had happened. I said, well, you all had an opportunity to answer. You had an opportunity to tell me what you were thinking about.
To find your voice.
Yes. That's how I had empowered that audience. Not one of the other speakers did that, though they all spoke very well. So what you had asked about another time when I felt angry. I felt angry when I was learning about how history books. So in 2017, in that summer, I was reminded that history books are written from a white perspective. And the person talking was showing original documents and original evidence of white lawmakers who were speaking out against African-American slaves being free, having any rights, and ways to subjugate them by coming up with these kinds of Jim Crow laws and restrictions on voting to keep them from gaining power. But the first time that I became angry, I mean, where I was physically having a reaction to what I was hearing was when I was living in the house with other African Americans, and I started to hear about the injustices that were dished out upon them, either on campus or some other place in their life. And I identified with that. And I said, really? Because I had never experienced anything like that. I just didn't know. I didn't know I was supposed to know. I didn't know how deeply rooted systemic racism has been until that first experience in 82, 83. And then again in 2017, where I had forgotten. And the man who was talking about it was telling us about the African American History Museum that was recently built in Washington, D.C. And he talked about the architecture. He said it's an inverted pyramid. And if you look here, you'll see it has you know, it calls to this African heritage and it calls to this African heritage, and this is an African thing. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, wait, isn't the pyramid an Egyptian thing? And he said, many people believe that, but before there were Egyptians, there were Africans, and that part of history has been erased. He says, here, let me show you an image of statues made out of stone. And he said, okay, it's not a clear depiction of a person, but you can see it's a face and a figure of a man. He said, look at the nose. That is a broad nose. That is a nose that spreads out at the base. He said, that would be an African characteristic, not an Egyptian characteristic. Before the Egyptians rose to power, there was another power that was purely African. And what he's saying is it was African as in black, not African because people were born on that continent. And he said that civilization died and has basically been erased. And ancient Egypt was raised up as a model of Middle Eastern civilization, but it wasn't the first one. And then I was incensed, just like everyone else in the room. We all kind of rose up kind of inside of ourselves and said, really? How unfair is that? And he kept showing us evidence after evidence of the existence of a highly intellectual African population of people long before the Egyptians. In fact, he showed us how artifacts from ancient Egypt were modeled after the previous dynasties. And he said, all of this is in that African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. He said he felt that the greatest disservice of that museum is that they stopped the history at slavery. They didn't carry the African American history into the slave period of the United States. Now think about that for a minute, Ernie.
So the history stops at the 1860s?
Yeah. Even before that, probably closer to the beginning of the 1800s when the slave trade started to take off. Even more. It flourished in the 1700s. So I said, how interesting. And he pointed it out. He said, you need to pay attention to this because that was the only way to get that museum built to get everyone committed, and all the money put into place was you weren't going to bring up slavery. And in effect, that is what one of the arguments is being presented today with respect. Remember, I made reference to how we talked about how Germany has been able to deal with the evils of its past because it brings it out and it shows it. They put up markers and saying, Jewish people died here. You know, so-and-so, a Jewish person lived here. So, and they've been making reparations for years. Well, basically, they took ownership over their past. And they've begun to reconcile it.
Let's be fair about it. They were made to take ownership of their past.
Yes.
They were conquered. You know, and I think that's the tragedy and the hardship that we're facing right now.
Yeah.
Is that after you face public humiliation and confronted your shame, it is much easier to make expiation. And this is the hard problem we have to face now, is that when you haven't been totally, and this is actually a problem I worry about a lot, actually, that, you know, in the last few minutes, maybe we can solve it, or at least characterize it better. Have you noticed that Christianity works best for people who are at the end of their rope?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Like arguably the most successful discipleship programs we have in the church are 12-step programs.
Yes.
When people have reached the end of everything. And then we have really good ways to help people lift out of that. And the question I've been obsessing over for several years now is it possible to preach radical discipleship to people who are not on the verge of losing everything? Because I think that this is very much the poignant question we are facing now about race in America and possibly civilization itself, is can we bring people to total repentance in front of the cross without everything being destroyed?
I would hope that we could. It's a great question. The end of the rope is a beautiful analogy for why in that moment of desperation, when you feel that all is lost except the single thread or the minor thread you're holding on to, and you have nothing left but to say, Lord, God, help me. And you have nothing in yourself to save yourself with. When that is totally erased from your mind and the very fabric of your being, is the greatest opportunity to see what God can do, to turn and then understand, oh, this is totally a God moment. Well, shouldn't we live more moments like that long before we get to the end of the rope?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And, for some of us, the Great Reset has convicted us, or convinced us rather, of how shallow the system of the world is to which we once belonged. Right?
Yeah.
There's Bill posted that video of the Great Realization. And there's an interesting, and I'm so grateful for this Great Reset, because I've been obsessing over this question, more or less with 9/11, of like, how do you build a new civilization without the old one having to die?
Oh, I've heard you ask this question before. Yeah.
Right. And the nice thing is that it's that the old civilization has a heart attack, and you realize it's mortal. And I mean, so let me give you a great unexpected role model in this. Steve Jobs.
Yes.
When he got cancer,
yeah,
he realized he was likely to die, and therefore he had arguably the best founder transition in the history of American business.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not perfect. People whine and complain, understandably, about, well, Apple wouldn't do that if Steve were here. But still, from a purely business and product and employee life perspective, yes, Apple has done remarkably well, compared to Disney or, other companies like that, which were, and very few companies were as founder-centric as Apple was. And to manage that, because he knew he was going to die. He wasn't sure when, but he knew he was going to die, and it might be soon. And therefore, he had the generosity to let go, and in many ways. And I think that the interesting challenge for you, Steve, it's not an Ernie conversation if I don't ask something insane or unreasonable, is how do you become the co-constructor of a new reality?
For
one
myself?
One of the things that's fascinating about you, and I realize why it's so easy to have these conversations with you, is you identify with the history of the African-American experience in America and with your father and all he went through. But as you mentioned, you yourself did not experience it personally until your 20s.
Yes.
And so I think one of the reasons you are able to do co-construction,
yes,
is because you are secure enough in your identity that you can say, hey, I don't need to be the focus here. I mean, I wrestle with this all the time. I think you've heard me share that. It's like, I have this thing that's burning in my heart, and I feel the need to impose this on people, but that's probably not the most efficient way to actually create the change I seek.
Right. I've also, the second part is, I've also lived on the Caucasian side of it, being completely oblivious to all that was African-American and the issues of race in America, because I was raised by a German mother in a German context more than anything else. And I've lived, I live that way.
Yeah, you're arguably you can be African-American because in many ways you were not raised either African or American.
Yeah. Oh, I like it. Yes.
Right. But that's always how this works, Steve. Gandhi was in South Africa as a lawyer. Martin Luther King was an academic in New England. It was when people who have the resources and privileges see their people, like Moses, and choose to identify with them in that,
Yes.
that they can elevate the conversation and the community. And, you know, the reason that's interesting to me is that there are places where I can poke you where your angry black man shows up.
It came out inadvertently.
Well, you're right. And so this is, I think have you watched any of the Marvel movies?
I've seen almost all of them. I think I have seen all of them.
Okay, so
except...
Bruce Banner, the
yes.
first Avengers movie.
Oh, yeah.
What's his secret? He's always angry.
He's always angry, yes. I love that line.
But, you know, this is the thing, and this is, you know, as long as I'm being unreasonable, let's go all the way. I want you to be the Hulk. I don't want you to be accidentally angry. I want you to be so in touch with your anger that you can summon your superhuman power when it is necessary and point it in the right direction to destroy the god of lies. You know, and because one thing that struck me about you is that you are very detached in your when you get into your professor voice.
Okay. I'll have to think about that one.
Exactly. Point made. Right? When you encounter an unknown threat, you would step back and you reflect and think, which is obviously a wise, healthy thing to do. But the price of that, as I've learned myself, is that Western culture idolizes dissociation. Right? The ability to step back and reflect on something is incredibly powerful. And when you see people who can do that, we have created systems that forgive all their other sins.
Give me the counterpoint. What's the opposite of that?
Well, the opposite, let's be fair, the opposite is the brute who will defend his family and his loved ones and his principles without thinking, out of sheer emotion.
Okay, got it.
Which is, if you will, the stereotypes of Western culture are the mama bear and the monk.
Yeah. The mama bear and the monk.
Right?
Okay.
Well, right. And so so I discovered there's actually a word to describe the alternative. And it's called self-differentiation.
The ability for one to differentiate their mood, their tone, purpose.
It's actually primarily about the context where I first heard about it. I should look it up, but it was a book about Lyndon Johnson, I think, where it said that basically it was talking about empathy. If you have too much empathy as a leader, then you will not make the hard choices that are necessary.
Right.
But the flip side is if you have too little, then you don't do it for the good of the community.
Yeah.
And this idea of self-differentiation, you know, is that, and you think about this, you look at heroes and generals. It's like, well, the greatest generals actually had compassion and empathy, but they were still able to make the hard choices. The Lincolns of this world, if you will.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
But when you're running an army, the next best person to have is the sociopath. Right?
Yes.
Who is able to make the hard choices necessary and is not swayed and panicking by the emotional things. And I realized that we have systems that are kind of, I think in terms of equations, right, are kind of cliff-shaped. It's like, okay, ideally you need someone right here, but you can tolerate people all the way over here and the system will still work. But if they go a little bit too kind, you all die.
Yeah, you're right.
And so it's better if they're here, but you can tolerate over here. Right? And all of our systems are designed this way. They're robust against certain kinds of failure. the whole indictment of Christianity and civilization and education and everything like that. But the reality is that, if you're trying to build a robust system, you have to tolerate certain kinds of error. And, what people, I think, do not appreciate is like, yes, the system is rotten, it's biased, it's unfair, but it kind of works. And it is remarkably hard to, the point is that these compromises and lies or deals with the devil are baked into the system, right? This idolization of intellectual dissociation goes back to Socrates, at least, and, Moses and Nehemiah, in a sense. Is they said to build a system that was robust and survive, we had to make these trade-offs and tolerate these kinds of evils in order otherwise we wouldn't be here at all. And, like the American History Museum, they had to make a trade-off in order to be allowed to survive.
Yes,
and
exactly.
The best thing, and it's like, and if you reverse that trade-off, when you've got an inverted pyramid, you pull the wrong block, it all falls down.
Yeah.
Right? Just ask those people who lived through the French Revolution. The system before was horribly corrupt, but you pull the wrong brick, it all falls down.
Yes.
And this is the quest. And I'll hammer this last point again. Like, there has to be a market for this. There is so much angst among top corporations in Silicon Valley about, like, we have been blind, we have not done enough. And from my perspective, interested in hearing yours, I think Leonard posted, the woke movement has a great indictment of the present, but a weak vision of the future.
Yes, there is no vision of the future there. It's just coming to awareness of what you didn't know.
And what this world needs, what this country needs, what this valley needs is a co-constructor who can help us build a new one. So this is not a thing to lament or blame people for. This is our market opportunity.
It's the opportunity. And we've touched on many of those topics every week that we've gotten together, which is, what is the personal transformation in Christ that we need to make personally? And then what are the external constructs in our spheres of influence or our community that we can touch upon and kind of transfer that change?
Yeah, but I think, like, I'm going to keep pushing on this, until you tell me to stop or I succeed. Like, there's a business model here somewhere.
Business.
Right? There are people who have lots of money who have no clue and are hungry for better answers. There's got to be a way to monetize that.
This is where your entrepreneurial thinking and creativity far exceeds my own. And I say that because when the answers that I have are Christ-centered answers, and that's not what the world wants to follow.
So, but here's the question, and this is maybe the interesting one, like, my perspective on this is that the world needs Christ. Christ is the only answer. We have to rebuild our institutions around Christ or we're toast. But one of the more bizarre things that I have learned, and I'm still frustrated by it, but this seems to be the way that God is working in this season, it is possible for people to repent without confessing. If people see the right way forward, they can say, I will do that thing because I see it as the right thing without me having to agree about the reasons why.
Yes, our legal system has mastered this in many ways, where you can accept responsibility, or you can how does I forgot the court term for it. you basically, you pay money to the victim without
no
any,
contest rather than pleading guilty.
yes. And then
Yeah,
nothing
and
more comes out about it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, this is a little bit deeper than that, although it's a similar level of frustration, right? Is that people need, so the best thing of all is for people to have a relationship with Christ. No question about it, right? But the second best thing, the thing we can tolerate, is people who agree with and follow the logos of Christ,
Yes.
without knowing him personally.
Okay. Which
right?
is
Like I have a
which
friend. Sorry, I have a friend on Facebook.
Go ahead.
Who's a
Yes.
flaming atheist, and he was pounding like everything that Jesus says you can prove rationally, and it's because it's the right thing to do. Like loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, all this stuff. So like he preaches the golden rule and all this stuff, even though he denies Christ. It's like, I would rather have that than a guy who agrees with the creed and does not feel obligated to live out the love of Christ.
Yes, because even in his humanistic capacity, he is going to choose to do a good and right thing.
Yeah, and that's the good and right thing. I think there is a deep and enormous hunger for that up and down the ranks of Silicon Valley.
Oh, I agree, but
and they have no clue what that is.
I'm thinking of Christian entrepreneurs that have created podcasts that I've listened to. Zig Ziglar is one of them.
John Maxwell.
Yes, that guy. That's exactly the guy I had in mind. I have a series of his CDs, and I'm going, okay. I totally respect and love the way that they approached their faith and saying, I am a Christian and I have this world viewpoint, and I believe that I can have an impact on my communities, business or investment, or in Ziglar's case, he started out like from a sales perspective, but then turned it into a way of coaching people through life. In modern, there's a new gentleman that's emerging. His name is Jordan Rayner, and he classifies himself as a Christian entrepreneur. Raynor, Raynor, and
Master of One. Call to Create. Yeah. Okay.
Call to Create. Yes, I have that book. I read that book. I read that devotional on the Bible app that inspired me to seek him out and find. So in along those lines, I'm going, oh yeah, I'm well aware of people who are well known or skilled in a business viewpoint or even in a teaching viewpoint, but are well centered in their Christian faith and use that platform to not preach the gospel, show the gospel. So not through what they say, but through what they do. And I love that part. So whenever I have the chance to speak in front of an audience, when I am teaching students, I know that I am there as a representative of Christ, and I do what I can to bring justice or mercy into my classroom environment while I'm speaking with people. I am attentively listening for any clue from anybody in the audience who believes something at a foundational level like myself, and I will go find them and talk to them, and I will query a little bit more. I said, did you know that the Bible says a lot about that? I did it yesterday with a client, and she said, oh yeah, I know the Bible. And I said, Lashara, I am so glad to have opened that door of a conversation with you. I always believed it was true, but there really wasn't a clear opportunity to say anything in our professional relationship until now. So then the next 5-10 minutes were about about our faith and our family and how that influences our work. I feel blessed to have had platforms from which I could present and be able to bring a measure of Christ and the gospel message to people. Your friend, the atheist, at the basic level, he agrees that there are more civilized ways in which people can live with one another, and that is exactly what the New Testament calls us to, how to live peaceably with one another and reasonably and sensibly. He just does it without the aspect of faith that cushions and buffers us when we have disagreements. And for me, that's the biggest difference from being a humanist to being a Christian, is the measure of God's grace creates a buffer space between our differing opinions and viewpoints. So, brother, I'm wondering about how to always be angry and let it speak for God as it's needed. I heard what you said, and I believe you're speaking about I will process information in my head and then measure what my outward expression should be more easily than I would just allow my expression to take over.
Yeah.
Although with you guys,
and that was what your father taught you, right?
oh my goodness, you understood that well, but he taught that from an extreme viewpoint. I mean, literally, to say absolutely nothing. He never, at no time in my life with him do I know that he stood up for the black man and said, I stand on the side of equal rights. I believe that I need to stand up and speak. He may agree with Martin Luther King Jr., and he respected Martin Luther King Jr., but he would never march. He would stand up and present himself as someone who believed in the unethical principles of systemic racism, because he was taught to be a rule follower through 30 years of military service.
That's how he survived.
That is how he survived. I was not, but I wasn't brought up to be a radical. I wasn't brought up to speak out, because my mother didn't like people who spoke out, even though she was one who could do it. It's a strong irony there. I've had to learn to be who I am.
We'll cover mother issues in a separate conversation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's yeah, but yes, the influence of my dad is pretty strong. You read a lot in that piece that I wrote. You understood much about his character. You captured a nuance of perspective that I would have shaped differently if I had understood someone might see it that way. So that was pretty.
The thing that
awesome.
The thing that I saw was, I was looking through the lens of my Joshua 1 devotional that I referenced earlier.
Yeah.
It is easy to do whatever we've seen our fathers do. It is so hard to do what we saw our fathers refuse to try.
Oh, absolutely. Man, that's a big topic, Ernie, because I can tell you how I have tried so hard in so many ways to be a opposite of my dad. Not to beat him, but sometimes to do better or to show better, because I could see areas in his life that were really failing. Even so, and it goes from something as kind of pedantic's not the right word, so mundane as barbecue grilling, to something as deeply spiritual as if you say God's name, you need to hold it holy and with respect. And if you say that you believe the Bible when you're standing in church, then you have to also believe it on Wednesday when you're not standing in church. And that was not my dad. So from the age of 16 through 26, my 16 through my age 26, I could see a lot of hypocrisy in him going to church and not really being a Christian. So that didn't encourage me to be a Christian. In fact, it probably helped drive me in the opposite direction. I had to have my own experiences and my own pain points. But putting that to the side, that whole topic of, you know, the things that my dad didn't do sometimes were so painfully clear to me that I said, I am going to be the kind of dad that does do these kinds of things. And it may be to such an extreme now that it makes my sons crazy.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother letter one day.
Yeah.
I'll have to write,
yeah.
I'll have to write that one down.
The other thing I think about your dad is that the tragedy of the previous generation is that they had to compartmentalize.
Oh yes, in order to make it through.
Yeah, and you know, and that had a cost. And I've gone through the cycle of being angry at my parents and Western civilization and the church and all these things, to just now, after many painful years, of being able to look on them with pity.
Oh,
and realize what they had to do, what they became, because they didn't have any better options.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the things that's funny about you know, what's happened with white America over the last 30 or 40 years is, you know, when the first civil rights movement came, Lyndon Johnson, JFK, they were the man, right? Yeah. They were the people who were in charge, and they had all the answers and whatever. And what's happened in the last 12 years or so is that there's no longer a man.
Right.
You know, say what you will about Trump. He is not afraid to complain about people harassing him.
Yeah. Which
is a really extraordinary turn of events from a historical perspective. And the positive way of framing it, there's many others, but the positive way of framing it is that, like, you know, the white guys don't have any answers either.
Yeah.
You know, and this is the really interesting opportunity, is that you and I, as people on the margins, between marginalized and unmarginalized, between black and white, we probably have a much clearer perspective on reality than any of our peers.
Yes.
Because we have that level of intellectual dissociation.
I would add the spiritual component of knowing who Christ is.
Well, yeah. I mean, we have the privilege of this space, and we have the privilege of knowing Christ. You and I, Steve, are about as privileged as it gets in this society. Because everyone else is shackled by both their power and their victimhood.
Yeah, interesting point.
I've often thought I'm the most powerful person I know, because everyone I know who's more powerful is powerful because of a system and a position they hold.
Yes.
And they are trapped within that system and that position.
Oh, good point. As opposed to the power coming from within themselves.
Or from Christ. Yeah. So, the politicians, the heads of companies, the governors, the police, they have more physical power, they have more financial power, but they are so trapped. And that's the thing that's really interesting as an opportunity, Steve, is that maybe you and I are the man. We're the ones who say, okay, I call it being the adult in the room, the child on the stage.
Yeah.
We're the ones who say, okay, let me explain reality to you so you know what's going on, and let me show you a way forward that A, you can understand, and B, will work. Like, if we can do that, there is an enormous hunger. And, you know, I can't speak into the African-American community and issues of race, hardly at all, but you can. And there is a word from God in this season that the church and Silicon Valley desperately need to hear. And I can't think of anyone else better qualified than you to speak it.
I feel the same poke. I feel that same urgency, which is, you could read it in the piece that I wrote about my dad, which was about the fifth different, what am I trying to say? That piece came out after 3 weeks of dealing with helping to explain the George Floyd situation and what systemic racism is to people who don't get it. So the next piece that I'm going to write tonight or tomorrow is about my great-grandfather who was born a slave, and how he rose to prominence as a Black Baptist minister in Texas at the turn of the century. When you'd asked me about speaking to the elders at your church, I remembered the sermon that I had done on the genealogy of Christ, and I had woven my own genealogy into the story as an illustration. And even in the 10 minutes that I was thinking about it yesterday, as we were exchanging text messages, I started to develop that whole idea even further. And said, well, how do I connect that story of Christ's genealogy, my genealogy, and the particular context that we are in? And I began shaping the whole message in my head. And I said, okay, Steve, that's a little unusual. I like where you're going with that, but maybe you should just do that on your own and not specifically because Ernie asked you, to think about that. Well, you didn't ask me to think about that topic. That's the topic that came to mind. And I still haven't stopped. I'm going to go find that original presentation and say, and now there's many other aspects I can weave into it. And the primary one is, if you look at the genealogy of Christ as it's presented in Matthew, you will notice that there are some distinct characters that you would never want to really identify in your genealogy if you were the type of person who is trying to be boastful or prideful, or you want to lay claim to something unique or special. No, part of Christ's lineage is Rahab the harlot. Come on now.
Yep. One of my favorite characters in the Old Testament.
And there's a few others. If you really want to talk about David's character and some of his deep falls, that's classic as well. But then there's these other minor characters in there too, and a number of women who are mentioned, which was not a common way of doing storytelling, and certainly wouldn't be a way to convince people to believe you.
Certainly you wouldn't pick Tamar and Rahab as the women you would want to include as bonus episodes.
Yes, Tamar. I forgot. I was thinking. I go, now who is that woman that? From before the 12 tribes of Israel. Which what was that guy? So anyway, Tamar. She's good. She's another one of those. I think, wow. So if you want to lay claim.
I just realized why this is so hard.
Why is it hard?
Is trying to explain white systemic racism to whites. They were raised on the mythology that they're descended from heroes.
Yes.
And when we say you were descended from villains, they feel like we're trying to shame them. And sometimes we are.
Wake them up a little bit.
Jesus.
Yes.
Right.
Redeemed.
Right. And this is something I don't claim to have an answer to yet, but I know that this is the challenge before me. Actually, I have an answer. Is that I always feel like I have to get people to face the bad news before they can embrace the good news.
Oh. Well, that could be an interesting way of introducing this topic. Go ahead.
Yeah, but so what happened is that lead elder in our church, Larry, man, I have a great deal of respect for, left his job as an educator at Valley to start an embroidery business because God told him to. And now he's part-time pastor of our church. He was sharing about what God's brought him through the last few years. And he says, there's good news. Like when when we plant a church or when I have a grandchild. And then there's the good news I didn't expect.
Yes.
Like when my wife got breast cancer. And I think the secret that I have to learn, and maybe this will help you too, is we're not here to tell people bad news. We are here to give them the good news they didn't expect.
Yes. Okay. Now you sound
That
like
they
my
have
counselor.
Rahabs and Tamars in their genealogy.
Yes. Yes.
And that's a good thing.
Yes. Now,
And if we can figure out how to help people face their deepest shames and greatest fears in the context of good news,
okay. So,
we could save the world.
let me plus one that idea. My counselor's name is Dean Smith. So he and I have been meeting together for 5 years, and over 5 years, especially in the first few years, I would come in and I'd talk through a couple different stories. And then inevitably I would save the worst story for last. So we'd have like 20 minutes left and I'd say, yeah, okay, Dean, I really need to talk to you about this. And, you know, doom and gloom, the worst story that I had to share all day. Didn't matter if I met him weekly or twice a month. The worst story, whatever it might be. And he trained me to think about it differently. He would say, Steve, that was the best story. It took me a while. So now, he said it a few times until I finally came back with a question. I go, Dean, why is this the best story? I feel awful. I really did something. I said, I feel awful about what I did or what I said. And he said, Steve, it's the best story. Because there will be a day when you are able to speak about it to others without any guilt or without any shame. And you're going to be able to help them by using this story as an illustration. What he did, Ernie, was he tapped into a fundamental characteristic of me, which is I want to be helpful to others and I want to teach them. So he knows that I can teach. He knows my heart is I want to be helpful. So he wrapped those two things together and he coaches me by saying, I can't wait for the day when you're able to tell people this story. You're going to free so many people from the guilt and the shame that you were feeling because you've now gotten past it. And you can share it with them and they can't argue with you about your story.
That's incarnation.
Yes.
That's incarnational. That is incarnational teaching.
Yes, that's what he does. Every time I talk to this guy.
But no, I mean, that's what you do. That's what he wants from you, right? Is this,
yeah.
Some level word, right? Right, it's that this is pointing. Teaching is pointing. Look, I'm not standing in front of you because I have all the answers and do everything right.
That's right.
I am standing in front of you as someone, as the sensei, the one who has come before.
Yes, that's
and let
all.
me just point to you what I was and who
Yes.
Christ is.
Yes.
And
yes.
give you hope
Yes.
that Christ can do the same for you, whether or not you use any religious words at all. Right? I mean, there's so much shame weighing down Silicon Valley and the rest of the country right now, where they realize the high-sounding rhetoric of how they thought about themselves
Yes.
is not true in a really painful and ugly way. And if we can bring Christ to them without using that name,
right,
there is so much freedom that people have. And you know, the way you articulate your story, it is so gorgeously beautiful. Anyway, I got to wrap up, get back to my family, let you get on with your life. But
you bet, and a whole vacation you get to experience.
Yeah, and then you have, so you're going to do, this is the soul food blog that you were talking about where you're kind of going through your family stories and things like that.
That's
so
what's going to go in there.
But think about this. This is the stretch goal, right? What if this is the raw material, if this is the launching pad for the co-construction journey that you need to lead people on?
I'm with you, Ernie. I believe it could be. I have never felt this strongly about writing. I have never felt this strongly waking up every day thinking, what am I going to write? What am I going to say? What, Lord, are you going to ask me to do today? Never before in my life like I have in the last 3-4 weeks, ever. You guys are a strong part of that because you do this ridiculous thing of encouraging me. And that is like, oh my goodness, what is it? When you add sugar to yeast, it energizes me. And it is the very thing that my counselor also knows. He says, if I give Steve a little bit of encouragement, he's going to multiply that and energize himself in ways that at that point, he just takes his hand off the wheel. He says, I don't need a counseling program for you, Steve. I just talk to you about what you're thinking. And then I offer you some questions and then you go away and you try to solve it because I'm committed to being well. He says, you're the ideal client. We have these highly stimulating conversations like you and I do, like we do as a group. And there's one other pastor that I know that I can talk with in the same way. Highly encouraging. So a little bit of encouragement drives me to even greater creative thinking and out of the box expression. I'm not missing this opportunity to see what's going on as a platform for the next thing I'm going to do.
All right. Well, as Hunter S. Thompson said, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. So I'll let you focus on your, let's face it, I can speak with authority on this one. You're weird, Stephen.
I've been called many things, Ernie, but I've never been called that with such pride.
So focus on being creative, but, you know, do the writing, do the thinking. But when you have something to say, let me work with you to figure out who to say it to.
Yes,
whether that's my church, whether that's we start doing cold calls to celebrity CEOs, I don't know what, but there is a story you have to tell that I don't think anyone else can tell.
Well,
and
yes.
The world is dying to hear it.
Well, Ernie, you're very encouraging and inspiring. It gets me writing each day. I appreciate that very much, and keeps me highly engaged with the Great Reset too. So, sincerely appreciate your encouragement.
Last request: can I post this as a bonus episode?
What did we just do? Were you taking notes?
We did an hour-and-a-half Zoom call. I recorded the whole thing.
All this time, I never
warned you about it at the beginning.
Probably better you didn't. The funny thing is, so up there in the corner, I kept seeing that, and I didn't pay any attention because I see it all the time when I'm in Zoom sessions, right? So I wasn't even thinking. Yeah, I don't.
You want to think about it? I can show you the link.
No, it's all good. I don't recall saying anything that I would ever want to retract, or, I mean, it's kind of long, but I mean, there's excerpts in there. I go, oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, this is all our back catalog.
Yeah, I think the guys would appreciate that little part of our conversation. So it's all good.
No, it's good. And someday when people look back at the refounding of post-Western civilization, the scholars will, some poor schmuck of a graduate student or the equivalent back will say, you got to go listen to all the stupid back videos with all the poor video and the rambling. It's like, oh, come on. To our future descendants who are forced to endure this, our apologies. Hopefully you'll have AI assistants who can pull out the good parts, but somebody's got to do the grunt work of reading through it first to make sure they didn't miss anything. That was you, man. We're thinking of you now. We feel sorry for you. We feel your pain. All right. God bless you, Stephen. On that note, peace out.
Have a great day, Ernie. Have a wonderful time.